so that we may share his wisdom and become one with him when he comes in glory. For he lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you very much for coming this morning, and apologize we got off to a little bit of a late start. I know a lot of people apparently on campus were late this morning because I guess there was something going on Palm Beach Lake Boulevard this morning and traffic. So I'm thrilled to present Jason Lesnetsky from the Educational Records Bureau, ERB, as you might commonly hear this assessment being referred to. Jason has been working for ERB for the last 4 years, but ERB is a very, very well-established company within the independent school community. And the truth is, I don't actually know a lot of schools that don't use the assessment for their standardized testing needs. So we're really, really happy to be making this transition this year. We do think it's going to serve as a really good resource for our teachers and our program, not only to gauge student development, but also to help really provide the roadmap, the necessary roadmap for curriculum development and making the necessary improvements. So I'm handing it over to Jason, and thanks for coming today.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Lesnetsky. I apologize for the start. Steve was very nice, but it was totally my fault. He told me at 8 o'clock. I had it in my calendar as 8 o'clock, and for some reason I did one of those flips and 8:30 was in there, so I thought I was doing well for time. But anyway, I'm really happy to be here. I spoke with faculty on Wednesday. Steve and I have been working together for almost 2 years, kind of going through the process of changing assessments from Iowa to CTP, which you'll hear more about today. I work with many schools, hundreds of schools over the several states that I work with for ERB. Many of them are switching over from other assessments. So we're very comfortable with the transition, making sure that administration, faculty, parents, students are ready for that transition to a new assessment, because I know it can be a big thing making that change. What we want to do today is kind of give you a little bit of background, give you some history on our company, a little bit about the test, the data. As Stephen mentioned, I've been with ERB for 4 years. Prior to that, I worked for Pearson Education in their digital learning department, both reading and language arts and math. And then prior to that, I was an elementary and middle school teacher in Broward County, Florida, where I grew up. So it's nice to be based in South Florida and be able to work with the schools directly. Really one of my favorite things when I actually get to go out to the schools. I do so many webinars and conference calls, but this is great when I can actually come out and work directly with the schools. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. There'll be chances for questions either along the way or save to the end. It's up to you. It's not an issue at all. So ERB is, I have these out of order. So a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to tell you a little bit about the company, Educational Records Bureau, a little bit about testing, a little background on testing, some specifics about the CTP, the Comprehensive Testing Program is the name of the actual assessment that you all will be seeing here, and then how will this information be useful to you. ERB has been around since 1927. It was actually founded at Columbia University's Teachers College. I would always like to draw attention to that 1927. We've been doing testing for a long time. Validity, reliability is extremely important to us. We partner with the largest testing company in the world, ETS, Educational Testing Systems, which does the SAT. I think they may do the ACT also. But they do many of the largest tests that are out there. So they help us with statistics, psychometrics, things like that to make sure that our test is solid, valid, and reliable. We do have available to them as well. All right, so just looking at assessments in general, we're all used to tests. When we were in school, you had tests at the end of a unit, a science unit or a math chapter. Teachers are anecdotally assessing students all the time. You have big major tests like SATs and ACTs. Of course, we all hear in the news and politics, NCLB and FCAT and Common Core Standards, all those things are out there. FCAT, of course, is a high-stakes test, meaning that the amount of funding that a school receives, whether a student graduates from 3rd grade to 4th grade, the bonuses that teachers get are dependent on the scores on those tests. That's high stakes. This is not a high stakes test. This is a very important standardized test that you take really good information on your students, and it'll give the school really good information to help them look at their curriculum and cohorts of students, differentiate instruction, but it's not a high-stakes test like the FCAT, so just make sure that that's clear. A good assessment is going to do multiple things. It's not just focused on one area. So it's going to allow you to check on growth and achievement. Obviously, you want to see, are the students growing? Are they learning? Are they moving up with the curriculum each year? It's also going to help guide curriculum and instruction. It's going to help you see if there's any gaps in the curriculum, if there's any areas that you might want to tweak or adjust. Maybe there's a professional development for the teachers that would help in a particular area. Maybe you see a gap in a group of students. A cohort that just struggles in a particular area each year. These are all the things that an assessment like the CTP can do. And then it's going to allow you to measure achievement against similar achievers. So this is a norm reference test, meaning that the scores are used, you can use the scores to compare to other groups of students. And you might have been used to, with the Iowa test, having national scores, and that is very important. Where would my student fall versus any other student in the United States? Public, private, charter, all those different areas. A national norm is very important, but we actually have a few other norms that ERB offers, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those a little bit later. All right, so a little bit more about parents and testing. Why do we test? We already talked about that a little bit, the importances of that. Of course, monitoring student progress is really the most important. Are those students progressing? Are we teaching what we want to teach? Are they learning what we want them to learn? To help diagnose student skills, and that's one of my favorites, is actually being able to look at the data and see that this is an area that a group of students is strong with, or an individual student is really strong, or the areas that they may struggle with a little bit, that aren't their areas of strength, that maybe we can help them build up. Monitoring curriculum implementation. Like I said, it can be a really good indicator if over time you see the same trend each year. You know the areas where your curriculum is really strong and areas that you can fill in those gaps. And then of course we're always planning for improvement. I talked about different types of tests. I'd just like to point that out again. All the different types. FCAT, high stakes test. Our test, very important, needs to be taken seriously. Students need to do their best. It's a great piece, but it is still only one piece of the puzzle. It's only one part of the entire child, of course, beyond their classroom grades, beyond their anecdotal from their teacher, beyond what you see at home. This is just one part of it. And obviously, there's different tests for different purposes. So, when I first joined ERB about 4 years ago, I started doing these kinds of meetings, and I did one in South Carolina. And the administrator when we were talking about, what I was going to talk about with the parents and go over and explain to them, and she said, one thing we never talk about is what a test like this doesn't do, what it does not measure. And that's really important. This is a measure mostly of reading, language arts, and mathematics of what a student can do or has learned along the way. But some of the things that a test like this does not cover: study skills, organization, collaboration, cooperation, communication, creativity, cannot be measured in a test like this. There are tests like that, of course, but this will not cover those areas. So it does go back to that big picture of a student. Some students are really good test takers, some students are not. Some are really good in the classroom, some struggle with their day-to-day, get their homework done, and those types of things. So you have to take all that into account. The other thing I like to point out with an assessment like this is it's a day in the life, which means a couple of things. It's great because it is a snapshot of where your students are at that point. A lot of people want to know, well, can we do test prep? Can the tutor help them for the test? Those kinds of things. Yes, but it's really not the purpose of it. The purpose is to find out where are our students right at that moment. So you can really get an idea of what they need to help build and fill in those gaps and just where they are. But since it is only a day in the life, it'll probably take place over a few days. There's multiple sub-tests that they take, so a couple of sub-tests each day over a week, or all schools do it differently. But if your child has a bad morning, a bad hair day, gets in the fight with their brother or sister on the way to school, doesn't feel well, any of those things can affect their score that day. So you do have to take that into account as well. The first year is a benchmark year. This is going to be a different test. Now, anecdotally, I've heard from my schools that have switched from Iowa to our test, they say the national norms are pretty close, that they have not seen much of a difference. Anytime you change tests, the scoring is going to be a little bit different. So you might see some, but for the most part, I hear there's not really a change. My schools that use the Stanford assessment, they actually notice a drop. Our test seems to be a little bit more difficult for them, and they see a drop in those scores. But Iowa, you really shouldn't see too much of a change. But once again, the first year you won't know, what's going on if they did have that bad day or whatever. The second year you get the test, they may have struggled in an area and you're surprised, why did they struggle in that area? And the next year it's a little bit higher, so now you can say, okay, that's probably more like it. But you still don't know which one is the anomaly and which one's the trend. The third year, now if you saw 2 years in a row where it was strong, then okay, that first year was just kind of first year jitters, had a bad day or something. So that's what you want to start doing. Keep your parent reports over the years so you can track that kind of thing. Very helpful. All right, so some specifics about the CTP itself, which is the Comprehensive Testing Program. So it's made up of many subtests. You're used to probably some of the subtests. The names are the same: reading comprehension, vocabulary, mathematics. We also have a couple of writing subtests, so you'll get information on writing mechanics, writing concepts and skills. But we also have 2 other different types of subtests. They're reasoning subtests. Achievement is what your child has learned or what they know. So it is those vocabulary, reading comprehension, writing mechanics. Reasoning is what your student is able to do. It's more of an aptitude or a capability score. Now, it's not an IQ test. It's not a 3-hour battery with a licensed psychologist. We use multiple choice questions in a 30 to 40 minute time period to determine this capability. So you're going to take it a little bit with a grain of salt. But we do use higher order thinking, critical thinking type questions to make that determination. Now, the nice thing is, since we have both reasoning and achievement in the same test, you can actually kind of compare those and see, is my child achieving on par with their ability? Are they underachieving in some cases, or are they overachieving? Which can happen where the curriculum's just really hitting it, a teacher's just teaching that student so well, building them up. They're, are an avid reader, so that's building up their reading comprehension or their vocabulary. So it's kind of nice to have that comparison. So you can compare their verbal reasoning score with their vocabulary, reading comprehension, writing achievement scores, and you can compare their quantitative reasoning with their mathematics score. So it's kind of nice to have those comparisons. The test does go grades 1 through 11. We align to the most basic standards out there. Once again, politics, the news, you're always hearing about different standards, Common Core, Florida Sunshine State Standards, all the different ones. We go back to the basics. So there's an organization called the National Council for Teachers of Mathematics, NCTM. There's another one called NCTE, the National Council for Teachers of English. And then there's an organization called the International Reading Association, the IRA, which just became the ILA, International Literacy Association. We base our test on those standards. We take those, and then because we work mostly with independent schools, we add rigor to those standards. We want to really challenge top students at top schools all around the country to find that topping out point. So there is some rigor in there to really kind of find where that is. Now we have questions all the way down to the low end as well. So within 4th grade, you get the full range of types of questions to really get an idea of where the students fall in each one of those areas. So we go back to those basic standards. Norming information, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a future slide. Being able to compare your students to other groups of students. I mentioned, we've been doing this a long time, testing the validity and reliability is important to us. Also making sure we're free of gender and cultural bias as well. And then we are a member organization. Schools actually have to join ERB in order to use any of our assessments. So we believe that really builds a camaraderie with our schools, with all of our schools around the country and around the world. We have a conference every year where our members come and we share best practices with them. They share best practices with each other. We also have task forces of teachers and administrators from across our school. Whenever we're coming out with a new version of the test, or we're going to want feedback on what the report should look like, or item writing for the test, things like that. We also offer a grant to schools that have innovative ideas. They can apply for that. And we also provide leadership scholarships to summer institutes over the summer to schools. So some nice things about being a member of ERB as well, beyond the strength of the assessments you receive. All right, so let's talk about norm groups. As I mentioned before, you're used to seeing national norms. It's that great comparison to any other student in the United States. Public school, charter, independent school, private, inner city, rural, suburban, all socioeconomics, all demographics would be represented in that national norm. We place all of those students on a monster bell curve, 1 through 99 percentile ranks, and then stay nines is the same thing, but instead of 1 through 99, you just have 1 through 9 at the bottom. They're grouped into 9 groups. So just a couple of different ways of looking at the data when you look at it. So that's great. Where do most of the students in independent on that big national norm? Bell curve over here, where it's at the 70, 80, 90. Research shows that that's where students, the majority of them, fall in that group. So when we move on to our independent school norm, we create that just with independent school students that belong to ERB and take our test at that particular time period. We redraw the bell curve from 1 to 99. So that means in this group of independent school students, there's a 1 percentile student, there's a 10 percentile student. And the majority of the students in that group are in the 40, 50, 60 percentile, the 4, 5, 6, stay 9. So you have to remember, you're looking here, national norm, most of the students in the 70, 80, 90 percentile, and then all of a sudden we scrunch it down to like this, and we're looking at just those kids up near the top, and we stretch it out again. So those 70, 80, 90s, some of them are going to be in the 30, 40, 50s as well. So you have to realize, what are we looking at? Why is it important to look at both norms? There's a couple of different reasons. I'm going to show you, I think, the next slide. I'm going to show you why it's important for the school to look at both norms. It's going to help them in differentiating their instruction. But it's also good for parents, for students to look at for perspective. The national norm, if you're getting that 70, 80, 90 percentile, your child's going to get into college, right? That's kind of the end-all, be-all goal. Where we get to the end is they'll get a good score on the SAT or the ACT. They'll have options for colleges, things like that. So you can be pretty confident with that 70, 80, 90 percentile. You're comparing in that group to every student in the United States that takes the SAT from all schools. But what if the students are trying to get into an Ivy League school? What if they're trying to get into our state schools? University of Florida, Florida State. My daughter's a senior. She has already been accepted to University of North Florida, UCF. She's biting her fingernails because next week they find out if they get into University of Florida or not. She's a great student, and she may not get into the University of Florida. Who is their peer group for that group of schools? It's the independent school norm. So that helps you know the group they're competing against. If their students are trying to get scholarships, that's who they're competing against. So it's nice to have both perspectives, the national perspective, big picture, and the independent norm, more specific picture as well. ERB also offers a couple others. We have a suburban public school norm that wouldn't be appropriate here, and we have some association norms as well. It just helps the school looking at the data in different ways and different comparisons. So we have a lot of options for looking at the data. Any questions on the norms while I'm here?
Just to clarify, the association norms, I never use the association norms that much, but my understanding of it is, say, if we wanted to self-identify, if I wanted to run a report saying, tell me about all the Catholic independent schools in the Southeast, that's the association norm.
Yes, if we have the association. So I don't now we don't have a relationship with them that we could, basically the organization would have to come to us and say, can you create a norm? And if we have enough schools in that association, we can create it, which it doesn't take a lot of students or schools to do that. But right now it's like the National Association of Independent Schools, the Florida Council of Independent Schools. There's a few different options. Southern Association of Independent Schools. And just another thing to throw out there, this group, I talk about that group that falls in the independent school norm, just so you kind of have an idea. It's the Benjamin schools in there, St. Andrews, Pinecrest, Miami Country Day, Gulliver Prep in Miami, Jacksonville, it's Bowles School in New York City, Horace Mann is in there. So just like Stephen had said, there are a lot of schools that use our assessment. So it's a really solid norm for giving you that perspective. Yeah.
It shows where they're at.
Next slide will actually do it perfectly. You let me know. this is talking about. So I mentioned that on the national norm, most of the scores are going to be 80, 90 percentile, right? So these are all grouped together. Section, when you look at their scores, here's a representation. The red bars are the national norm. This is a group of students, like a grade level at a particular school. And then these are all the subtests. So verbal reasoning, vocabulary, reading comprehension, writing mechanics, writing concepts and skills, quantitative reasoning, and mathematics. Notice here, there is not much differentiation between the scores. How do we know which this group of students' strengths are and what their areas of concern? Sure, we've got one score that's not in the 90s there, but it's an 89 in reading comprehension. So maybe that's an area to be concerned about, but otherwise you can't really see it. The yellow bars are the same group of students, but plotted on that independent school form. And remember, now we're taking that group of students and we're spreading them out across the entire. So now look at where the scores change. Now we see our verbal reasoning, writing mechanics, and mathematics. That reading comprehension now really shows up, because not only is it only the only 60, but it's a 67. And now we have these three in the middle. Writing concepts and skills with quantitative reasoning. So we know these are the strengths. We know these we need to keep an eye on and maybe look a little deeper into what's going on with that area. And we know reading comprehension, this is an area we need to dive a little bit deeper into. What's going on here? And we have reports the school can use that can dive down and see, is it explicit information that they're having difficulty with? Is it reading in context that is the issue? And then that's where they can kind of link things together and see what's going on. Is it just a group of students? Is it what we're teaching? Those types of things. Does that answer the question? No? Okay, sorry, go ahead. I jumped ahead of you.
Well, no, because what I'm learning, because you, like you said, you keep going back to the curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying that if most of the kids are showing weaknesses in one area, then how does that relate to the curriculum?
So what it's saying is, basically it creates a conversation, is what it turns into. I mean, the data is not going to tell you this is the problem. It's going to tell you that this is lower in relation to all the other ones. So now you know to dig deeper. What we have is we have a standards list. Like I said, we're based on the NCTE, National Council of Teachers of English standards. And they list in reading comprehension, let's say this is a group of fourth graders. In reading comprehension in fourth grade, here are the things that fourth graders should be able to do in reading comprehension in fourth grade. So now this is telling us that this group of students is not meeting all of those standards. They're not able to do those things. So now we look at that list of things and say, why? What is it we're not doing?
This is taking the whole group of students, not
absolutely.
So you're going to be looking at individuals, and then you're going to be looking at the entire group.
Absolutely. So the school has a whole group of reports that they'll have access to. And I'll work with them on understanding where to use those reports, how to use those reports, those types of things. And there are administrators here that have used this test at other schools and are comfortable with them as well.
Yeah. Right. So within that group, you might have some ones that are extremely high achiever and extremely low achievers, but you're going to look at that and say 67% overall, that entire class really isn't learning that.
Big picture, exactly. And that's usually where I start with the school, is I start with administrator level reports that show you big picture, this is what it looks like overall. But then the next report I take you to, it shows you, that's a perfect segue, because it takes you to, so here's what the middle group did, like the 50th percentile kids, but then here's what happened with the 75th percentile kids, the 90th percentile students, the 25th and the 10th. So then you'll be able to dig even deeper to see that the upper students are falling below the norm, but the lower ones are above, so you can dig deeper and deeper. It just keeps on digging down as you go further into it.
Can I just add something too? Just what Jason just mentioned, something about creating this conversation. And I think that's really the true value when you talk about curriculum development. I could give you, and I think of specific examples that we've lived in terms of when you get the reports back from the ERP, they break down like the math category and all the categories into subcategories. Okay, so there are all these different skill sets, and you'll see, from my prior school, 8th graders, for whatever reason, we always bombed on probability, and probability was the one area that we could not get a hold of. That created a discussion about probability and how we wanted to either reinforce it or accept the scores for what they are and just say, listen, they're testing in January, but we know they're getting probability, it's just not happening until March. So
Okay,
it has to
so,
do
yeah,
with
it's gonna give you
timing, it
lots of
has to
measures.
do with
Yeah,
the
no,
conversations that it creates.
Okay.
Another area of concern for us was always measurement. You know, simple task, what you would think, but for one reason or another, that school just did not do measurement very well in the curriculum. That encouraged a broader conversation between multiple grade levels.
Okay.
So it's about the conversation, I think, and that's how you see curriculum grow.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so that kind of gives an example of how the school would use the two different norms. I also have a couple of slides in there. This is kind of more for you. This is a part of one of the parent reports. And it just gives you the illustration of the difference between the two norms and how the scores will change. So here's an individual student and their scores on the national norm. And you see here, once again, 70s to 90s. You can very easily see what the student's strengths are and then what stands out as an area of concern. But if we plot that same student on the independent norm, this is how much it can change the scores, just by switching it from this to this. So just be aware of what you are comparing to, the group that you are comparing to. We still see the strengths are here, and this is still the area of concern, and then this is kind of in the middle. But notice how you can do that, how you can switch it between the two. And I'd just like to illustrate the difference between the two groups. Okay? Yeah.
Will we all get both groups in our reports, individual reports?
I think that's what we were talking about. Yep.
Oh, so you're gonna get the national and the.
Yeah, you get to choose, we get to choose as a school which norms you see, and we would intend to give you all.
Okay, you decided to do
Yeah.
national and.
All right, so kind of closing up, I'd like to show a couple examples of the reports. Not really clear up there, but you get kind of an idea. This would be the report, you're starting with second grade, right? So we have a different report for our second grade testing. We added our primary grade testing, along the lines. We've been doing third grade now since 1927 probably. But the company added it based on requests from our schools. It's always been kind of our philosophy. When's the earliest time to start testing? When are students prepared for it developmentally, those kinds of things. But we had enough schools saying, we want to start testing, getting them ready for the later grades, kind of prepping them for that. So we did create the primary level test. But we did a little caveat with that. We don't give national norms or norm percentages for those younger kids. We just don't think it's appropriate. They're not ready to see the data in that way. We don't want to start pigeonholing them on the bell curve in percentiles. So it's much more anecdotal, the second grade report. It tells you which skills your child exceeded expectations in, which ones they met expectations, and which ones they're developing towards or they're building to. And what's neat about this one is it actually lists out the skills all the way by sentence. It really gets very specific. So this is actually actionable information you can use at home that you can see uses context clues to determine the meaning of a word or phrase in a text read aloud and chooses the correct definition or synonym. So these are activities, if you're reading before bed with your child, you could actually use that information to kind of focus on different parts of what you're doing. And then, of course, the school can use that information as well, based on individual students or groups also. So it's a neat report for that grade, but I like to point it out that the second grade report will look different from the third grade if you have any children of those ages. And then the third grade and above report looks more like this. You get a little explanation of what percentiles are, what stanines are. You also, there is a PDF document that the school will either email to you or they'll post on their website for you to download or print it out if you want with the parent report. And it's about a 4 or 5 page PDF document, but it really goes into depth into what are these things, what is tested in them, what percentiles are, scaled scores, things like that to help you understand the report at the time. But basically it'll list all the scores that all the subtests the student took, their scaled score, which is kind of just our number that we need to use to develop the norms. It's kind of an internal number, but we provide it to you. This is a vertical scale score, meaning that every year as the students learn more and the content gets more difficult, the range of scores is going to go up. That means that your child's score should go up each year. So you want to keep an eye on that and see that verbal reasoning increases, somewhat every year, maybe 5 to 10 points in that range. That's not a hard set number, it's just typically that's around what we see. So over the years, you'll be able to see that number increase. And then this, of course, is going to tell you where the students fall in each one of the groups. So you see their percentile, what percent of the students did they perform better than in that group, and then with the other groups as well. And then Stay-Nines, like I said, is just, instead of spreading out 1 through 99, it spreads it out into 9 groups. The nice thing about the Stay-Nine is it simplifies it. You can very quickly look and see, okay, this student struggles with writing mechanics and is really strong in vocabulary and verbal reasoning and reading comprehension. You see a big difference there. Usually a 2 Stay-Nine difference tells us that it's a big swing, or a significant swing, I should say, in statistics terms. So that's really nice. But you do have to be careful with the way bell curves work, because sometimes a 1 Stay-Nine difference can mean 3 percentile points, and sometimes it can mean 20 percentile points, just because the way a bell curve works. So you can use this for quick glance, but you really want to use this to find out, which ones are the strengths and which ones are the areas you want to look at the most. And then the bottom is just a graphical representation. I showed you that earlier, so you can very quickly see the diamonds are their actual score from above, and then you can see where their strengths are, the areas that they struggle with. And then the shaded bar is kind of a plus or minus, a standard error of measurement. If the student took the test on multiple days in multiple situations, this might be the lowest score they might get, and this might be the highest score they might get. Any questions on either of those parent
I
reports?
just wanted to ask, so do you have any idea like how many pages you're going to give us? Are you going to give us just like 1 page, or is it going to be like more like a 3 or 4 page report with a little bit of extra stuff that we can look at? Or do you have
I think first, Jason and I are working through those things right now as far as really what makes sense for this community. And I also, especially first year, we're trying to really align it to what you're used to seeing with the IO as well. Just because if we were to give you so much data in one,
then you're going to
Yeah.
have problems.
And that's what we offer. Is
You're going to
that's
open a can of worms. And
historically, what I've also always done in any setting is cull through all the reports, look at the subcategories, and there are things that I want to draw your attention to. When I literally send home the notes, we'll write a little love note on it and say, when you come in, have a conversation just about this.
Okay.
That's what I like to do,
But in the
especially
beginning,
first
you
year,
might just
because
do the 1 page thing.
yeah, because it's a lot of data.
It's a lot of data.
And and if you're not used to looking at it, it can be a little bit overwhelming, and you're not really sure what to do with
So
it.
if we did have a question, we could just
Yeah.
call you and come in. And
Yeah, that's
That's
what
best.
I've always
like that,
found
rather
is
than
really the
putting it
best
all out
option.
and having everybody-
And I will say, Terry, I've been working with assessment for almost 20 years. Terry
Okay.
Kent has been working with the assessment for a long time as well. We're very comfortable with it. We understand how to read it.
Yeah,
Perspective is really important with it. So that's typically sort of the course of action.
okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
And that's what most schools do, and that's what we typically recommend. Our parent report is 1 page, just to keep it simple to the point.
Okay.
You get the information, and yeah, we usually recommend make an appointment. They can go into
Something
deeper
if you
data.
see
Exactly. So I do like to close. This was one of my favorite things when I was a teacher, and all through kind of my education career, is the teaching and learning cycle, I call it, but it's also the assessment cycle. This assessment works perfectly in that cycle. We're always assessing students, whether it is that classroom chapter test or anecdotally, or classroom participation, or a test like ours. Based on that assessment, we're reporting information back to the student, the parent, the teacher, the administrators. Based on that reporting, we make adjustments to our teaching, whether it's curriculum adjustment, whether it is looking at a cohort and finding that gap and trying to fill that gap for that group of students, or it's professional development, or something along those lines, extra lessons that a teacher does. Based on those adjustments, we reassess, and this cycle continues on and on from birth through, all the way through the end of education. So it works really well. This assessment builds very well into it. And we also do have a correlation to the college SAT. Students that do well on our test tend to do well on the SAT as well, as they get closer to those grades. And I always like to bring that up as well. So thank you very much. Any other questions on anything that I covered or anything else about the test, the assessment?
When are they getting tested?
They're scheduled to take it in March.
Okay.
The 2 weeks before, the schedule has got to be finalized, but it's basically the 2 weeks before spring break.
And it's just for starting it in 2nd grade? And just the difference between the Iowa testing, like obviously, it seems like you have a lot more slicing and dicing that you do, but what is the biggest difference between this test and the Iowa testing?
So yeah, we kind of have a policy of not talking about other tests, but just from my knowledge of it, Iowa has been around for a long time. I will tell you, it is used mostly by public schools, or it was before state testing and NCLB, things like that. So I think the biggest things that we do talk about with ours, of course, is that it is designed and used by most independent schools out there of all levels. So that's one of the big ones right there, is that added rigor to really find that top out points for top students. So that's part of it. And then it's also the norms that we offer. That's a big one. I believe Iowa only offers national, maybe a form of an independent, but they don't have anywhere near the number of independent schools that we do to make that a nice, solid, strong norm. And I don't think the other norms, like the associations and things like that. The data, it's one of the things, like I said, I've been in this industry for years also. The data that schools get, like you said, the slicing and dicing that you really can do with it. And then we really believe our service also. You know, Iowa, I think that some of those other companies are used to working with big school districts, so one-off schools usually is not their priority. I don't want to talk anything about how much they offer, but we really like working with our schools. We're used to working with independent schools and like type of schools. And so it's, you know, like I said, I sit in my office a lot doing webinars and conference calls, but this is what I love. I love coming and working with the schools on the data and using reports that I wish I had in the classroom, you know, 20 years ago.
And I also just add that I think the biggest, and Jason, you did talk about this, that, you know, the Iowa is called the Iowa, in its entirety, it's called the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. So it's a lot of rote information. You know, they'll cover, you know, when was the Declaration of Independence signed, and all those sort of factual things. Jason alluded to those reasoning subtests of the CTP4, which is much more interpretive. It's much more skill-based. It's much more abstract reasoning. You know, a lot of the information on those reasoning tests is legitimately things that kids have not been exposed to before. So it's more about giving them the tools, giving them the pieces of the puzzle, and can they figure it out or not? And it's about, it really helps, I will say also, when you, as you're preparing to do algebra placements or math placements and things like that, to understand readiness, true readiness, is a really useful tool for that, because technically you want to understand, does the student have a capacity for more abstract thought before you go placing them in the course? So that's very helpful. So, yeah.
Question. Here it says the CTP correlates to the SAT. So when she takes this test this year, although she's getting ready to graduate now, some of the schools require that the children take the SSAT, the different schools, and the ICE. Which one would this test most correlate to?
Sure.
Because she's had to.
Sure. So, and then just so you know, I don't think you were alluding to this, but the college SAT and the SSAT are totally different tests, right? So we actually, our company owns the ICE. We actually, right. So there's not a direct alignment. They're very different assessments, where this one's focused on achievement and that one's admissions. And we could get into kind of the philosophical reasons. But both tests have the same 4 subtests. So the IC has quantitative reasoning, mathematics, verbal reasoning, and reading comprehension. The CTP has all 4 of those as well. So the questions are going to be very similar. They're going to be aligned difficulty-wise to the grade level, things like that. Once again, I don't know a lot about the SSAT. I know that that's used by a lot of schools for admissions as well. They're kind of split between the IC and the SSAT across the country. So yeah, so it would be, I mean, not a direct correlation, but it's actually, they're very similarly aligned. Yeah.
The CTP also has a writing section that is different than the Iowa test. Is Rosarian participating in that?
I would think so. Most schools do, but it will be up to the school whether they do those. We have 2 writing subtests, one focused on mechanics, which is punctuation, grammar, capitalization, things like that, and then writing concepts and skills, which is more main idea and, you know, that type of thing.
There's an additional 3rd assessment that's brand new, really, called the writing practice.
RAP, the writing assessment program.
RAP assessment, where it's actual writing prompts. That's brand new though, and we were talking about probably launching into that next year.
Yeah, so that.
So 2/3 of the writing section, yes, this year, the last piece next year.
The parts that I was talking about that are already built into the test, they're multiple choice questions. So, it's looking at a sentence and answering, should the comma go there, A, B, C, or D, where should it go, that kind of thing. So it is assessing writing basic skills, but obviously their writing style, their writing skill. And yes, we have another assessment that actually takes their writing and scored by live scorers, given scores on a 6.6 trait rubric. And yeah, we've been talking about that as well, that it's a little too much to do everything at the same time.
What is that when you said earlier, it said something like the test is not gender specific? Does that mean they will be using he and she in questions?
Not necessarily. It's more. Yeah, more that it's not gender biased. It's not biased to any group. It's free of gender bias or
Okay, so
anything
it's not like
that.
you're not putting he or she.
No. It's just there shouldn't be more he questions than she questions, or things like that going into anything along those lines. Basically, it's saying it's going to be as politically correct as possible. It's going to try to make sure that there's nothing that could influence any type of child. There's no questions along those lines or examples, anything like that.
When the kids see it, would you think they'd be looking like, oh my gosh, what is this? Or are they almost like?
They're very similar.
Okay.
They're paper pencil tests, so they'll open a test booklet, it'll have the instructions. The teachers will have instructions with a script to follow that says, students, please open your test booklets. You will have 45 minutes to take this section, all of that. So it's very similar, the type of instructions and things like that. I did mention earlier that this will be a benchmark year. I mentioned the rigor of our tests, so there will be tough questions that they may not be used to from the Iowa. They may come home and say, it was really hard. You may hear something like that. But they're also going to have the questions that are more appropriate for their level as well, or wherever level they fall. So, it's different, and the first year will be a benchmark year. You're going to start kind of building the data from here as you look at those reports and collect them. But as far as the style, everything like that, it's very similar.
And while we are not, no independent school really ever, teaches to the test and does that sort of work. I mean, we all kind of understand that. Probably about a week before the assessment, we are going to be doing some practice questions, more just to get kids comfortable with the assessment, and get kind of in that mindset, so when they open up the booklet, it's not completely, we used to do that for the Iowa as well, just to it was more about mindset and get them into the habit of doing it. I do also like to give some kids, just some friendly tips about how to, what to do with the test, because there's some habits that they're into that don't work in our favor when analyzing the data. What to do with, what happens when you run out of time. And you'd be surprised, child has got 2 minutes left, okay, I'm gonna fill in the last 10 questions. And that really throws off the numbers. What we tell them is that if you get to the question, you give it the best shot you absolutely can. And if you need to even narrow down the last 2 questions and make an educated guess on one, that's okay to do. But it's not okay to guess if you're just out of time and you're just randomly filling in bubbles. That's not good, because what I want to know as the administrator looking at the data, if they run out of time consistently on all their tests, that suggests something completely different that I want to know about. So in that regard, it's just important that the kids do it the correct way. So is that?
No, you nailed it. That's exactly right.
Are they able to write in the booklets, like especially on the math section? Are you saying no, like nobody's, like, do they get a scrap sheet of paper, or are they able to write in the booklet, or?
The second grade is a consumable test, so they will have.
Third grade actually is also. Both your second and third.
Is a consumable test. Fourth grade, they'll have scrap paper and things
Scrap,
like that.
but it'll always have a piece of scrap paper, so if they need to, on any section, not just the math, I can always have that piece of scrap
Yep.
paper.
And the other option for the middle school test, correct me if I'm wrong, Jason, is that the second section of the math section will also allow use of a calculator too. So
That's in middle school.
Yeah, that's in middle school.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's something that we'll talk to kids about as well.
Okay.
2 questions. What grade does the calculator start? 5th graders have not used calculators to this point. So
I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I have to double check that also, but it's
they're
the
learning
calculators
the concepts now,
actually.
so they don't want them to.
Well, and so that's it. We'll have to talk about it, because the calculator is actually optional even on our test. Not every school does the calculator. So if the math program
It's
at your
allowable.
school, it's allowable. If the math program at your school is designed for that level of math to not use a calculator to be able to do those
That means
functions,
it's operating.
you know, without, then they should not need a calculator. But then there's other schools that have that built into their curriculum. They use calculators for
Yeah,
calculations.
and I
so-
only mention it because it's just a variable that, you know, we'll do what makes sense, you know, we can get a reference test.
The other question, do you allow for accommodations?
Yep, if the student has some kind of documentation, whether it's from a psychologist or from, you know, an internal 403B, we call them IEPs, things like that, it typically has to have what the accommodation is for and what the accommodation is. Typically time and a half, double time, depending on if whatever it's called for. Students with visual disabilities, they can make the test booklet larger, things like that. But yes, absolutely. Anything else? Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate everybody coming today, and I'm looking forward to working with Rosarian.
Thank you to Mr. Fell who videoed today's presentation. I suspect by next week that will be available on our YouTube channel. Mr. Fell?
I'll have to talk with Lewis, but I know it was live right now, and we do have it recorded as well.